Okay, that's better. Less of a glitch than usual.
Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Terrell Rolston, and currently I work as a research associate in the Zoe Michkovsky lab at Acadia. And I don't currently do bee stuff in my day job. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys about bees today because it really is my passion. And I'm super stoked in September to be going and joining Paul Manning's lab at the Dow Agricultural Campus, where I'm going to be looking into bumblebees and some important let's say trade-offs maybe with using commercialized bumblebees to pollinate blueberries, especially in Nova Scotia. But today my talk is titled Beyond the Honeybee, Importance of Native Pollinators in Nova Scotia. Now, I don't want to out anyone, but can I just start with a show of hands? Who here is a beekeeper? I'll raise my hand because I also keep a few bees.
Sort of.
Sort of. So
can't.
one sort of. Nobody else keeps bees at all. You guys are in the past, okay. You guys are ahead of the curve, maybe. Sorry.
In the past here, but it was just out last Wednesday splitting hives with a friend.
Okay. So as I'll introduce and talk more about, the honeybee maybe gets too much attention. And I'll get more into that in a moment. And really what I want to talk to you guys about today is native pollinators and especially native bees and the importance of those native species here in the province. And if you didn't know, honeybees aren't included in those native species. About myself, I'm from Canning. I grew up in Sheffield Mills. And I kept honeybees with my dad. At one point, we would drive somewhere around 70 colonies around the province pollinating blueberry fields. And it wasn't until I went off to St. Mary's in Halifax, did my undergrad in biology there, where I learned that there was not only a diversity of other bee species in the province, but honeybees were not amongst the native ones. And beyond that, as I'll talk more about, honeybees can't really pollinate blueberries, which is quite perplexing. Farmers pay a lot of money to pollinate blueberries in the province and across Canada. Okay, so I always like to begin with acknowledgements and thank you. I wouldn't be here standing in front of you if it wasn't for all these folks, from my supervisors in the past to my current PI, Zoe at Acadia. And a special shout out to Dr. Tyler Smith from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Ottawa. Without these folks and funding organizations, I wouldn't be here today. Like I said, I'm going to talk to you about bee stuff. It's not what I'm doing right now, but it's all in the same ecosystem in my mind. So all of this training and investment that's gone into my training has enabled me to continue to do my passion on the side. Like Alan mentioned, I am leading bee walks at Acadia at the Harriet Irving Botanical Gardens. And the next one is Saturday, July 4th from 10 a.m. to noon. And spots are limited. So if you are interested in attending, please send an email to the Casey Irving Center at acadiau.ca or give them a phone at the phone number there. Or come chat with me afterwards and I can probably get you on a list if that's a bit easier, more accessible for you. And what we do at these bee walks is we get you guys catching bees. So I introduce the tools of what it takes to be a bee scientist. It's not much. It's a net, which you can see in my right hand, a vial, which you can see in my left hand, and off screen, or actually just behind me there, is a cooler with some ice packs in it. And so what we do is we actually get folks catching native bees right off flowers themselves. I show you how to put it in a vial, put it in on the ice, and what it does is it cools them down and sort of sedates them. It makes them a bit sleepy. And then you can actually handle them in the palm of your hand and spot and identify them up close to what species they are. And it's really quite a transformative experience. I think I maybe recognize a few faces in the audience today, and the amount of people that have come out thinking that the word bee is synonymous with honeybee and leaving with a new fascination with native bee diversity really does motivate me to keep doing these types of bee walks. This date in August, I'm not going to be in the province. So that's going to be run by Emily McLean, who's a master's student at Dalhousie, as well as some other student helpers that have been helping out. And then I'm hoping, I should be in Chura at this point, but I will come back to the Valley for Saturday, September 12th as well. So yeah, those are the dates for the rest of the summer. if you're interested in knowing anything more about that or have any questions for me, please find me after. I'd be happy to tell you more about those. They're lots and lots of fun. It's pay what you can by donation, and all the donations go to the student helpers who help me put on these events. So, okay, so I want to give a little overview. What am I talking about today? I'm not going to lie, I'm going to cover a lot of topics decently quickly. And so I hope I don't go too quick, but I wanted to give just enough depth to really give you an understanding of what pollinators really are. So what is pollination and why is it important? Let's start with the basics. Then we're going to go into beekeeping in Canada and what I like to call the honeybee myth. Then we're going to talk about pollinator and bee diversity specifically in Nova Scotia, threats to and decline of native pollinators, both in the province and globally. And then finally, what can you do to save the right bees? Which of course, I mean our native pollinator species. So pollination 101. What is pollen? Pollen, the word pollen is Latin for fine dust. And what it is it's the sperm of a plant. It's the microgametophyte. And in this image here, this is a scanning electron microscope of a bunch of different species of pollen grains. And so the diversity of a flower, the shape and color of different flowers is reflected in the pollen as well on a microscopic scale. And really what pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther, either by a pollinator or some other wind or whatever have you, and transferred to the stigma where it's fertilized and then allows that flower to grow seed. And so, of course, many of us are fascinated by this mutualistic relationship between flowers and their pollinators, but why do flowers attract pollinators or animals in the first place? Well, it is a mutualistic relationship. They get one thing and the bee gets another. And really, if you're a plant, you want the bee to have sex for you. That's what's going on, is to transfer pollen so that the plants can outcross and increase their genetic diversity. And really, this enables really precise sexual reproduction in plants versus grasses are just relying on wind to sort of happenstance blow pollen in the right direction. And this adaptation has evolved independently. The number increases every year, sort of 36 times in evolutionary history, maybe. So this seems to be quite a successful strategy for plants to spread their pollen. If you're a pollinator, it's a tasty reward to go and collect pollen. So not only are they giving you pollen, plants are also giving pollinators nectar, which is a combination of glucose, fructose, and sucrose. So it's complex combination of sugars compared to, honeybee keepers love to give bees sugar water. It's just straight sucrose. It's horrible. It's like Doritos. Anyways, really what that is a tasty reward to attract pollinators, and they're adapted to have high carbohydrate diets. And then the pollen itself is made up of protein and lipids or fats. And so really this is a really nutrient dense food source that bees and other pollinators have discovered they could use and leverage for their larval development, for their young development. And long story short, you might have noticed this, they look quite similar. Bees and wasps are cousins. And somewhere in evolutionary history, essentially a wasp figured out that I don't need to eat other bugs to get my protein. I can just go to a plant to get my protein from the pollen. And over evolutionary time, this has led to a coevolution between these plants and their mutualistic partners, and angiosperms, or flowering plants, now make up the most diverse group by far of plants in the world today. And that's due to no small part due to this relationship between plants and their pollinators. Again, this spreading of pollen allows for sexual reproduction, which increases diversification rates. Genetic evidence places the first bees somewhere around 150 million years ago, which is sort of the early Cretaceous period. So I can't remember the name of the biologist that said this, but he coined it as the longest advertisement campaign in history, which I quite like. Because of course, flowers are attracting bees to them through their colors and through scents. And this image here is of a beetle, and zoomed in there, you can see some pollen grains in its hair, which is preserved in a piece of amber, which is when sap is fossilized. And that's the oldest physical piece of evidence we have of pollinators on the planet. We believe that the first pollinators were actually beetles with magnolias. And that's still a relationship that continues today. Magnolias are only pollinated by beetles. They're not pollinated by bees and other insects as well. And really that leads me to my next point is not all plants are visited by all pollinators and vice versa. There's special combinations of traits for plants to attract certain pollinators and certain traits that pollinators have to access certain plants. And so it's really important to remember that to have a diverse plant community, you need to have a diverse pollinator community. You can't just have one without the other. I see a few young folks in the audience. I have a little meme for you. Why is diversity in the plant pollinator community important? It means better performance and outcomes, and also the same button purple. And really what I'm trying to say there is if we want healthy ecosystems, we need to have a healthy pollinator community. It's plain and simple. And, you know, it's often hard to find reasons to motivate financial people to care about conservation. It really is, right? Of course, I don't have to convince any of you audience members that conservation is important. You guys are all predisposed to loving nature, but unfortunately, and to enable the scale of conservation which we need today, we need money to do that. And so the easiest way I've found to communicate this sort of issue is discussing things like stock portfolios, like the S&P 500. And so we all know that to protect yourself against perturbations in the market, you want to diversify your portfolio of investments. And that's essentially what you're doing when you have a diverse ecosystem, is you're protecting it to, let's say a particular pollinator had a bad year, didn't reproduce very well. Well, there's another pollinator to come in and fill its role. Versus when it's depopulative of different diverse species, there's just nothing to replace something when another species is lost. And that's when you start to see extinction cascades where one extinction leads to another species extinction and so on and so forth. And so this term pollination services, amongst ecologists, it's kind of become a controversial term because it's sort of been hijacked to just mean financially. But really what I mean by pollination services is what pollinators are contributing to society, nature's contributions to people. Globally, between 85 to 95% of angiosperms relies on animal pollinators. And so if we lose bees and other pollinators tomorrow, we lose the way that terrestrial ecosystems work and look like, and the world would look entirely different. Now, of course, someone has gone out and done the numbers. It's somewhere around $775 billion annually, and that was an assessment done in 2012. So it's probably well north of $1 trillion today, the contributions that wild pollinators specifically, I should say, not honeybees, contribute to the world economy is quite huge. And some of you have maybe heard this term, 1 in 3 bites of food relies on pollinators. It is true, about 35% of the total volume of food produced in the world does at some point rely on pollinators. So there would be a reduction in productivity in 85% of 130 of the world's leading crops if we did not have pollinators. They are essential to feeding people on Earth. And as I'll talk about on the next slide, honeybees aren't really the best ones for the job. So I'm going to present 3 case studies. Hopefully we're all familiar with these tasty fruits: apples, tomatoes, and blueberries. So some work done in Nova Scotia by Corey Sheffield back in the 2010s. He found that flowers that were visited by native pollinators tended to produce fruit that were not only larger, but more numerous as well. The fruit itself was more symmetrical. And that's because more of the ovaries were sufficiently pollinated so that the fruit could actually, radiate out and expand symmetrically. And he also found that mason bees, or Osmia species, have a pollination effectiveness that's about 10 times that of honeybees. Other studies into mining bees or Andrena species have found similar numbers as well. And so, certainly farmers do use honeybees to pollinate apple fields, but they might not be the best bee for the job. Now, if we look at lowbush blueberry, in the case of lowbush blueberry, they have a particular type of behavior that's called buzz pollination. And I'll show that a bit later on another slide. And previous research, actually, Steve Jabrick contributed to this research in the audience today. Steve, as well as Sam Vanderkloot, who was a professor at Acadia a long time ago, found that when when flowers were pollinated by native bees, somewhere between 87 to 95% of those set fruit, compared to when they were visited only by honeybees, about 25% of flowers set fruit. So it's a much higher efficiency. And the reason for that is honeybees aren't able to do the behavior called buzz pollination, which is how the majority of blueberry flowers get pollinated. Another flower, your tomato flower, which has this very long covering here that covers up the stamens, right? The pollen is in there, locked up. Now, if you were a plant, why would you want to hide your pollen? You want your pollen to be out and accessible, right? Because you want a bee or another insect to come along and transfer it. Well, it's sort of an evolutionary trick. It's like a lock and a key. Bumblebees, as well as a few other native species, have this behavior called buzz pollination. What they do is they latch onto the flower, and I'll show a video later on. They buzz in a high frequency, and that releases pollen from the flower. And so if you're a tomato, you don't want to invest all that energy into producing pollen, a bee come along, take your pollen, and then fly off to an apple tree, because you want your pollen to go to another tomato. And so what this is saying is, listen, if you can figure out how to pollinate me, you can have all the pollen you can get your hands on. And so it's a lock and a key. It's essentially increasing the chance that it will go to another tomato flower and pass that pollen on. And that's something that honeybees physically cannot do. So if you have tomatoes at home, I hope you guys have some bumblebees in your area. Okay. So this photo here, the Western honeybee, or sometimes called the European honeybee, it was brought to North America with European colonialists in the 15th century. I want to preface this by saying that a lot of what I'm going to present doesn't really make honeybees look in the greatest light. It really doesn't. However, I do want to acknowledge the fact that today, in our current agricultural systems, people don't get fed without this species. So we can't just be all, let's get rid of honeybees. We have to find a way to sustainably switch to native pollinators, at least in my humble opinion. And so it's not black and white. It's not one or the other. It's a really complex situation, but I do believe the way in which we manage honeybees is irresponsible. And so the Western honeybee, or Apis mellifera, is native in this blue area here. So parts of Europe, the Middle East, all of Africa. So it has really quite a large distribution. Of course, what you can see in the diagram here is all of the red. That's its introduced range. It's been globally introduced. And that's largely because they're really good at what they do. They're really good at going to new places and visiting new plants, which, if we didn't manage them in boxes and they didn't make us honey, would we want that? Would we want this bee to go all around the world and to visit plants everywhere they go, to successfully establish in different places around the world? Of course, in Canada, we have winter, so it gets too cold for them because they're not adapted to living in the cold very well. And so they die out mostly over winter. But in places like California and Australia, honeybees have become feral. And there's quite a lot of ecological consequences because of that. Most often they'll not only compete for food with other natives, but they'll also take over a lot of bird dens or nests. And in Australia, I think it's led to the extirpation of somewhere around 50 bird species in different places in Australia. And so what you can see here also is in Europe, the circles here represent the abundance of wild honeybees today. And so certainly there's lots of honeybees in Europe, but they're mostly managed. There's really only two populations, mostly in Poland, of true wild honeybees. And so they were actually just declared endangered by the IUCN. And so we live in this complex world where these managed species are native to an area, but they're no longer really native. And so we often hear about save the bees, right? But are honeybees really declining? They certainly have high mortality rates. Like if you guys have any beekeeper friends, it's hard to beekeep nowadays. There's a lot of disease pressure. There's a lot of overwinter problems. But in 2017, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization reported that around the world, there's about 91 million managed colonies of honeybees. At a conservative estimate of 20,000 honeybees per hive or colony, that puts you somewhere around 2 trillion honeybees globally. That's a lot of bees. And that number has increased by 80% since 1980. Honeybees aren't really in decline. Now, if we look at iNaturalist, hopefully most of you are familiar with iNaturalist. It's a community of where you can upload photos and people will identify your photos online. And if we look at honeybees in terms of the number of observations total of all bee species, which there's somewhere in the ballpark of 30 to 40,000 bee species in the entire world, this one species makes up 16% of all observations. And then you can see pretty much anywhere in the world where there's somebody with a camera, there's a honeybee. They really are everywhere. Now, in terms of beekeeping in Canada specifically, in 2025, there was a record number of beekeepers in Canada at 850,000, or sorry, bee colonies, I should say, at 850,000. And again, between 20,000 to 100,000 bees per colony, that puts us around 21 billion to 85 billion honeybees in Canada alone. It's really quite a large number. Now, despite all the problems with being a beekeeper today, all the new challenges that have emerged over the last 20, 30 years, the number of apiaries in Canada has doubled since 2001. So the industry is alive and well. It's doing perfectly fine. I'm not saying that there isn't challenges. There's new challenges for beekeepers. And I'm certainly, a lot of people could push back on my opinion on this, but in terms of save the bees, I think they're doing just fine. And so really what that is greenwashing. And if you're not familiar with the term greenwashing, this is the practice that a lot of corporations tend to do. And sometimes for whatever reason in popular culture, we just get obsessed with a certain idea and don't really understand the background of that idea. And so this is a practice of giving a false or misleading impression that an initiative is environmentally friendly, sustainable, or beneficial when it's really not. So when we talk about honeybees, not really environmentally friendly. Other things like wildflower seed mixes, especially off the internet, when they're not, you don't go to your local nursery and ask, where did you get these seeds from? Are they even from Canada? Did you collect them in this county? Right? A lot of these seed mixes have invasive species in them, so be really careful if you're purchasing online. And this really has contributed to pop culture. Maybe some of you guys know this character, Barry Benson, from the Bee Movie. Yes, of course, we all loved the Bee Movie. I did as a child. But unfortunately, the concept of native pollinator has not really penetrated mainstream media. I will say in the last 5 years that I've been keenly interested in this, it is starting to change. So I am feeling more optimistic about the future. And to really drive this home, I want to give you an analogy. So who here is a birder? Who likes to bird? Show of hands. Good number of birders, right? You care about helping to protect and conserve migratory birds, right? You might, in your garden, plant certain tree species to help certain birds come through. If you wanted to help bird conservation, and you cared a lot about bird conservation, would you go out and buy chickens? It's livestock. And the exact same thing can be said about honeybees. Beekeeping does not equal bee conservation. They're two different things. I'm not saying that beekeeping can't be done, but it needs to be done responsibly. Just like if you have a dog, you have a leash. If you're a beekeeper, you best be planting flowers and a lot of them to feed those bees. But if you live in an urban place where you barely even have a backyard, you might have enough place to put a beehive, but they're going to go to the surrounding community and to start compete with the wild and native species in the surrounding area if you're not feeding them enough. Anyways, I always really like that analogy. It really drives it home. Like honeybees aren't really helping the picture here if we care about protecting and conserving native pollinator species. Now, this is my opinion, but it's certainly not the opinion of every scientist or pollinator scientist out there. This has been a large topic for debate and still is an ongoing debate, I should say. And so these are all papers that were published in Science, I think in 2018, 2018. And so it all popped off with these authors here putting this paper out. Conserving honeybees does not help wildlife. Essentially, they propose this is managed livestock. This is not wild species. Honeybees aren't providing an ecosystem service in the strict sense. They might be pollinating apple fields, but it's a managed input, right? Do you spray fertilizer and say that's an ecosystem service? No, that's an input you've put into the ecosystem. It's not naturally occurring there. Then these authors came back. These two papers were in response to this first paper. The first one that said bee conservation, honeybees and other managed bees, not only honeybees, there's other cases, are playing into bee conservation. Crop pollination doesn't happen without honeybees. Ignoring managed pollinators in and of itself does not improve wild bee conservation. So let's not be so hard on honeybees. But to push back on that, these authors weren't saying that honeybees aren't important, but they certainly aren't helping wild bee conservation. And then this paper sort of takes a neutral stance. They say, hey guys, stop fighting. It's not productive to be fighting. There needs to be a united front of beekeepers and conservationists. We need to be working together. And I will say that's very true in my experience. Beekeepers have been some of my best allies in getting the native bee message out and spreading in the community. So I don't mean to alienate beekeeping entirely as a hobby. Again, my dad to this day keeps honeybee hives. Although, we have interesting conversations sometimes over supper. And just to really drive this home, these guys, they were like, oh, well, if you're going to say something back to us, well, we're going to say one more thing. And really, they really push for a clear definition, differentiation between beekeeping and wild bee conservation. They also promote things like better regulation of beekeeping. Of course, in Nova Scotia, you can't transport them across provincial lines. So that's one way that they can be regulated. But they also suggest exclusionary zones in protected areas. And there's certainly protected areas in this province where I've seen honeybees either really close or even in the protected area. Again, they're non-native species and they are going to be taking resources from our wild natives. So this is something to think more about. Now, what is really pollinator diversity? I want us to just take a second and just imagine a pollinator in our mind. Just think of a different pollinator. And so some of these might have come to your mind. Of course, we have bees. Earlier, I mentioned somewhere around 30 to 40,000 wild bee species in the world. Of course, butterflies and moths or lepidopterans, also very important pollinators. Moths in particular are nocturnal pollinators. So there's some native plants that only get pollinated at night by moths, which is quite interesting and very understudied. I don't know much about this, to be honest with you. Hoverflies is another one. Did anyone think of hoverflies? Or flower flies is another name? Yeah, I see one hand. These guys are really cool. I really like their biology because as young larvae, they eat aphids and other pests in your garden. So they go from eating pests and then they become adults and they become very important pollinators. So it's like a double benefit in your garden, which is really quite cool. And then all kinds of other things. Really anything that comes in contact with pollen, whether on purpose or by mistake, could be a pollinator. So mice, I love this photo of this bat here, absolutely just head to toe covered in pollen. Monkeys, pollinators. Yes, wasps. Most people are kind of shocked by that one. Now, some of these species aren't actively collecting pollen. They just happenstance, incidentally, get pollen on them. And wasps are an example of that. They drink nectar from flowers, and just by mistake, they pick up pollen on the way. Birds, this is a parakeet. Birds are also very important pollinators like hummingbirds as well. And there's lots more. Again, anything that's going to be getting pollen on it and transferring it to another flower, that's a pollinator. Now, of course, I'm going to focus mostly on bees tonight. The reason why I think bees are the most important pollinators is they have the most behavioral and physical adaptation to go and collect pollen. They're actively collecting pollen from plants to give it to their larvae. So they are very, very important pollinators. In Nova Scotia, there's somewhere north of 200 native bee species. Would anybody guess that? Now, across Canada, there's somewhere north of 1,000 native pollinators, which is more than the number of bird species there are in Canada, to give you an idea of just the amount of diversity. Now, of course, when we think about bees, we oftentimes think about honeybees, and we know that they're social. They have a queen, they have female workers, and they have drones or males, and they have different roles in society. They're social altogether. The majority of bee species, the vast majority of them, are not like that. They're solitary. They're single moms. They're going out and foraging on their own and raising their young on their own. There's not a queen sort of dictating the colony, if you will. Now, bumblebees do have colonies. They are social like honeybees, and I'll talk about that a bit more on the next slide. Another key distinction is most bees, believe it or not, don't live in boxes. 75%, around 75% of our bees live underneath your feet in the ground. They nest in soil. And the rest of them, I'll talk about a few of them, will nest in stems and cavities in wood. Sometimes they'll dig out a cavity where it's an existing stem, maybe it's a pithy, maybe something like an Arubis genus that they can dig out and make chambers quite easily. And really, this is just a snapshot of a few different genera in the province. I'm going to zoom in and talk about a couple of them because I don't have that much time, I don't think. And I do want to, so this is the life cycle of a bumblebee. Now, we're about here in terms of the life cycle. So let's start there, okay, in the spring. In the springtime, we call them foundresses. The queen bumblebees emerge. So unlike a honeybee colony where there's still other workers living through the winter, only a queen overwinters. So all the workers and all the males in every colony die off in the fall. That queen will go out and forage, first for nectar, till she builds up her energy stores, and then for pollen. And that pollen is what she's going to feed her first brood of larvae. So she finds somewhere to nest. In the springtime, if you see those big chunky bumblebees zooming around on the ground or zigzagging back and forth, they're looking for a place to nest when they're doing that behavior, that zigzag back and forth. Somewhere in the early spring, the colony will establish. Once the first brood hatch, the workers come out, they take over the foraging. The queen then starts to run the hive, starts to run the colony. It will grow in numbers across the summer, depending on the species, somewhere between 100 to 400 individuals, give or take. And then they'll start to produce males and virgin queens in the fall, and they'll mate in the late fall. Those mated queens will then overwinter. The males and all the workers from the previous season will die off in the fall, and the cycle begins again. Across the province, there's 15 species of bumblebees, so not every bumblebee is the same, and how you tell them apart is their coloration patterns. So I don't have time to talk about every single species today, but if you want to get into bumblebees, they're really fun. Like, they're one of the easiest bees to ID on the wing. Of course, there's some, like, literally in the name, Bombus perplexus, the confusing bumblebee. Some are a bit more difficult than others, but yeah, there's all kinds of fun stuff you can do with that. Now, this is what I was talking about earlier with buzz pollination. Now, there's sound, and hopefully, I think the sound is working on Zoom as well. What I want you to listen for at first is going to be a very high frequency buzzing. And then when she flies off, you'll hear a much lower boom. It'll go from zzz to boom. And that's the change in frequency. They're using the same muscles that they use to fly, but they're vibrating at a much higher frequency. Did everyone hear that? One, really quite cool, right? So keep an eye out for that in your own garden, especially tomatoes. Now, our next bee, we're getting into ground nesting solitary bees now. So again, these ones are living on their own. This is a mining bee, or sometimes called a miner bee, Andrena species. They're medium to largest size bees. And the key distinction about them is they're the most speciose in the province. There's about 35 species of them. And really how you tell them apart is a few different ways. First, they have these dense hairs in their foveae. It's like in their cheeks, in between their eyes. You can really see these dense hairs packed in there. And they also have their pollen collecting hairs, or their scopa, I'll use that word again, on their hind femur. And so in this photo, you can, in this photo, you can see the pollen on her leg there, densely packed in those pollen pants. And they're really quite fabulous, especially if the pollen of the plant is pink. Oh my God, I love that. When they get those pink pants on them, it's so pretty. And it's really important to remember that only the female bees are collecting pollen, right? Because they're feeding their young. The males are only really foraging on nectar. Okay, this is my personal favorite bee in the province. This is the bicolored striped sweat pea or egg bee, Agapostum virescens. And how you can tell her apart is she has this metallic green body or thorax and head as well. And then on her tail, she has this black with white stripes on her abdomen. It's really quite smart looking. She also has her scopa on her femur. And these are coming out right now. In fact, just on Friday, I was walking the dike in Wolfville here, just along the waterfront. And if you look very closely here, see all these, might think those are anthills. Those are all bee nests. This bee species nests in communal aggregation. So it's a solitary bee, but it has some neighbors. They build these nests together, and they are a bit communal, but they don't really have a queen per se. And in a second here, I'm going to play a video of one starting her nest. You can see her start to clear out. That dirt. They really are iridescent. Under a microscope, they look brilliant. You see her just digging there. You can see the pollen collecting hairs on her hind legs.
Look at her go. That is so cool.
And so I didn't walk the whole length of the dike, but in about a kilometer, I'd estimate somewhere between 500 to 600 nests. So quite a large community, and they have really high site fidelity. So if you find them in one spot, they oftentimes go back to the same spot next year. Our next bee is another sweat bee. So this is where common names start to fail us because they are related, but distantly, or Lasioglossum species. And sweat bee, they get their name because they'll actually lick sweat off of you. And I've had this a couple times. It's pretty cool. It's because your sweat's full of electrolytes and they need electrolytes. And this is the second most speciose genus in the province. There's 30 species, and there's a large variation in size. And this is a specimen I have at Acadia next to a loony. It's about 2 or 3 millimeters long. That's so small you'd think it might be a fly if you weren't looking closely. And generally speaking, these bees are a bit harder to identify. Really what to look for is they have a sleek wasp-like body. Sometimes they also have these dense black and white hairs on their abdomen. But this is really a hard to identify group, but one of my favorites as well. One of the reasons why they're one of my favorites is this subgenus Dialectus, which is one of the hardest to identify. They come in all sort of different metallic blues and greens, and it's really quite pretty, especially against those yellow white hairs. It's really some of the prettiest bees in the province. So now we're going to get into stem and cavity nesters. So this is about 25% of our species in the province. And so here we have Xylocopa virginica, and this is an interesting bee. Now, it's relatively large, and it looks like a bumblebee, right? It's pretty similar to a bumblebee, especially one bumblebee called Bombus impatiens. The key distinction is its abdomen or its tail is completely smooth and hairless, as well as if you look at her head, it's really quite rounded. And they sort of have a U shape in the back of their head. And this is what her nests tend to look like. You can see that she does dig out wood. Now, some of you, if you're keen bee lovers, might be thinking, Xylocopa, I didn't think that was in the province. Well, they've recently come to the province. So these are 2 observations on Unnaturalist, one in Halifax in 2023, and again in Sydney just last fall. And so this is a new arrival to the province. They're probably coming in with wood, is my guess. But I can't really say. But there has been observations in Maine, This one in PEI, I took a look at it. It's garbage. It's no good. It's a bumblebee. But certainly these two in Nova Scotia are confirmed sightings of this species. So keep an eye out for it in your garden. If you spot it, try to take a photo, put it on iNaturalist so scientists can start to understand its new arrival here. Next, we have the Ceratina species, or the small carpenter bees. And they're about 4 to 12 millimeters, depending. They still have that rounded head, okay, with that U shape. You can see it from a top-down view. And they have a swollen abdomen. See, it's kind of more oval compared to the others, is a bit sleeker. And one of the interesting characteristics about them that especially are important for telling species apart is they often have this face marking, or what I like to call face paint. This white, sometimes yellow face paint that they'll have on them. And they like to nest in pithy stems. So you can see one here starting to dig in. And so a lot of you might have bushes that you cut back in the fall, right? My advice to you, when you cut those stems, don't just chuck them out. Build a pile somewhere, maybe on the periphery of your property where it's, maybe not the prettiest always site, but bees will come along and start to nest in those stems if you just leave them for them. And the final bee I'm going to talk about is the leafcutter bee, or Megachile species. And there's quite a few of these in the province as well. I think around 13 or so. And what sets them apart is these large serrated mandibles, or teeth, if you will. And what they do, I should say also, remember most of those other bees had their pollen collecting hairs on their femur. This bee has it on the underside of its abdomen or tail. So that's really quite a distinguishing characteristic about this bee. Also, mason bees do that as well. Some of you maybe have heard of mason bees. And what this bee does is where it gets its name from is it cuts sections of leaves off to build its nests. You can see one in flight there. And wow, I've seen this happen in person. It's really quite brilliant to watch it come along and just collect a leaf like that. And so she'll build these cells and lay her larvae in them as well. Now, unfortunately, we are in a new epoch. The Holocene is over. The best, most ecologically stable period in our Earth's history is gone. We have changed the environment so much, so fast, that entomologists have coined this term a death by 1,000 cuts. So we don't really know exactly, but it's somewhere in the ballpark between 45 to 75% decline in the total global biomass of insects. So bees included. We don't have the best data for all bee species. For bumblebees, it's somewhere around a quarter are in decline in North America, some of which are endangered in Canada. But most of those native bee species that I just talked about, as well as others, are understudied. We just don't have good population estimates to really know how much they're declining. Now, I can remember this as a young kid, and many of you will definitely recall this. When you went on a road trip, could you get to Halifax without having to clean your windshield? No, you go 100 kilometers, you got to stop and clean your windshield. I remember that as a very young kid. The younger generation has no idea what I'm talking about when I say that. And that's really evidence of what's going on. And that's just in my lifetime.
I have a field beside me full of summer dandelions.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, that would be a buzz.
Oh, yeah. And there's a number of threats to our native pollinator species. So largely speaking, habitat loss, the loss of diverse flower communities. Paved Paradise put up a parking lot. Really, that's the most contributing factor. There's other things like invasive species. Climate change is changing when bees are emerging and when flowers are flowering, leading to mismatches when flowers come out and when bees come out. There's also increased pressure from pesticide. You spray pesticide like mad. Orders of magnitude greater than application rates are recommended. Parasites and pathogens. And one thing I want to talk about here is invasive species. I kind of alluded to this earlier. Now, most of you wouldn't consider honeybees to be an invasive species, and that might be a controversial distinguished title, but this term, massively introduced managed species, it's true. We have honeybees in orders of magnitude greater than most wild bees. in many ecosystems. And they're competing with other wild bees several different ways. So some of you have maybe seen on the internet cases where honeybees will actually competitively knock other bees off a flower, or hummingbirds as well. Those videos are quite astonishing. This is one of the biggest ones, exploitative competition. This is competition for food. Food is a finite resource in the environment. And when we introduce honeybees in several, tens of honeybee hives in a location, they need food. And so they're going to go find it. And they're really good at going far distances. Compared to our natives, honeybees can fly 10 or more kilometers. Most of our native solitary species live their whole life in a 100-meter radius, 100 meters. And then there's also other issues like transfer of pathogens and parasites from honeybees to native species. As well as when you bring honeybee hives to places, it attracts predators, and then those predators start to eat the wild species as well. Now, I want to talk about one ecological disaster, which in American fashion has been named the Super Bowl of beekeeping. Now, who here likes almonds? I love almonds. One of the worst, most environmentally horrible crops on the face of the earth. 80% of almonds are produced in like 8 counties in California. And there's a large issue with water and drought in those areas. Another issue is the use of honeybees. Over half of the hives in the United States are driven to those 8 counties once a year to pollinate those almond fields. Look at how expansive they are. There's no native pollinators there, so they demand honeybees. And what happens is, you can imagine, not only does transporting them from every state in the US stress them out, what happens? You put them all in like 8 counties at one time. What happens to animals when they're densely populated in one spot? Disease and starve, right? And then they get transported back to their home states. Yay! Let's spread disease all over the country. So this is similarly happening in Canada, not on the same scale as this, but there are migratory beekeepers that say start with canola and then go into blueberries or apples, and this is a thing. Bragg's Bees does this in Quebec, despite legislation preventing you transporting bees across the border. He's exempt from that, and he's like 80% of commercial honeybees in the province. So I don't really understand the point of that legislation. So that's enough doom and gloom. What can you actually do to help save what I call the right bees, the native pollinators? Well, first and foremost, it's pretty simple. It's a simple solution. They need food, and badly. So I want you to go and plant a diversity of native plant species, but specifically pay attention to when they bloom. You want to have a community that can support bees through a whole growing season, from early spring into early summer, late summer, and then into the fall. And I'll talk about some plants on the next slide. Another one, leave the leaves. We're so quick to tidy up our yards. Those leaves insulate the ground and help ground nesting bees and other insects survive the winter. My rule of thumb is try to leave leaves until it's 10 degrees Celsius for 10 days in a row, which roughly is about mid-May, give or take. Avoid pesticides at all costs. Now, HWA is a real issue. So there are times when you need to use pesticides. There's a master's student in Kirk Hillier's lab who's looking into spillover impacts of pesticides on native pollinators. But man, these things stay in soils a long time and continue to impact native insects for a very long time. So please try to avoid them. And the fourth one, contribute to community science monitoring, such as iNaturalist. There's another great app called Bumblebee Watch for bumblebees specifically. And this is a really, really quick snapshot of some native plants that I think are good for pollinators. People always are asking me what plants do I recommend. Unfortunately, I've been renting for so long, I've never been able to grow my own garden. I could probably have paid off half a mortgage by now, I think. But these are some great ones. So in the spring, some of our earliest flowers, believe it or not, are trees. So sugar maple, red maple, number of different willow species that are native to the province. Service berries or Amelanchiae are great as well. Then when you get into the summer, there's a lot more diversity in the summer, but these are just a few. Virginia rose, I think, is great. I love listening to the buzz pollination of a bumblebee on a Virginia rose. Swamp milkweed, of course, we all know this is a larval host for our favorite monarch butterfly. But they do attract pollinators as well. Last summer at the Irving Botanical Gardens, we saw Bombus terricula, which is a species of concern, declining species in the province, visiting the swamp milkweed. Meadow sweet, Abby Denis, who I think gave a talk here a few months ago. She found that this was the most visited plant at the Botanical Gardens. So really important plant there. Into the fall, we get Joe Pieweed, my personal favorite, Canada goldenrod, and New York aster. Those are just a couple. Anyways, that was a really long talk. I'm done talking. I appreciate you all for listening. Those are the dates for the bee walks, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
I'd like to introduce Terrell Ralston, who has been teaching at Acadia, and I believe is about to go off to British Columbia to do a no.
Dalhousie and Churro.
Oh, okay. Oh, so you're going to be around. I thought we were losing you. That's why we wanted to make sure you got this talk in before you.
I was possibly going someplace else, but I found.
So you're doing a PhD, right?
That's correct.
At Dalhousie Agricultural College.
That's correct.
School.
Yes.
Whatever it is. Okay.
Yeah.
I first, as many of you, Terrell came to us, like a couple of people said, we need to have Terrell talk because they had gone to some of the bee. He's been doing or coordinating bee walks at Acadia, and I believe there's one coming up soon, which I'm sure he's going to tell you about.
That's
I didn't put it in my announcements because I figured you'd plug it.
Absolutely.
Doing some wonderful work around native bees. And so we asked him to come share some of that work tonight.